March 21st, 1988. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, 11:43 p.m. Eastern Time. Dean Martin sat across from Johnny Carson, a glass of what looked like whiskey in his hand, telling a story about his son. 7 months earlier, Dean Paul Martin, fighter pilot, actor, and Dean's pride, had died when his F-4 Phantom jet crashed into a California mountain during a military training exercise. Dean hadn't been the same since. Neither had his appearances on late-night television. What happened in the next 90 seconds would become one of the most suppressed moments in Tonight Show history. "Dino was a hell of a pilot," Dean said, his voice softer than usual, almost fragile. The audience was quiet, respectful. Johnny nodded, listening the way only Johnny could, present, attentive, giving his guests space to grieve on national television. Dean continued, he loved flying more than anything. More than the movies, more than the music. He said the sky was the only place he felt. A voice from the back of the studio cut through the silence like a blade. "Pilots like him killed innocent people. He got what he deserved." The entire Studio One at NBC Burbank turned as one organism, 300 faces searching for the source. Dean Martin stopped mid-sentence, his mouth still open. The glass in his hand didn't move. For a moment, witnesses would later say it felt like an eternity. Dean simply stared into the darkness beyond the stage lights, his face transforming from confusion to recognition to something far more dangerous. He stood up. Johnny Carson's smile, that carefully maintained mask of professionalism that had survived every crisis in 30 years of live television, vanished. He reached for Dean's arm. "Dean, hold on." But Dean Martin was already moving. The audience didn't know whether to gasp or stay silent. Cameras swiveled, operators frozen in indecision. In the control room, director Bobby Quinn was screaming into his headset, "Commercial! Go to commercial now!" But they were 30 seconds away from the scheduled break. 30 seconds that would feel like 30 minutes. Dean walked down the 3 steps from the stage platform into the audience seating area. His movements were deliberate, controlled, terrifying in their calmness. He knew exactly where the voice had come from. Row M, seat 14. A man in his 40s, wearing a faded green military jacket, was already standing, already realizing the magnitude of his mistake. Security guards appeared from both sides of the studio, but they hesitated. This was Dean Martin. This was Johnny Carson's show. Nobody knew what protocol applied when a legend walked into the audience to confront a heckler about his dead son. Johnny was right behind Dean, his hand on his friend's shoulder. "Dean, come on, pal. Let's go back. Come on." The man in the military jacket was backing up, hands raised. People around him were scrambling out of their seats, creating a perimeter of empty space. Someone later recalled hearing the man say, I didn't know his son died," but his words were drowned out by the chaos. What happened next depends on who you ask. According to the official NBC incident report, filed 3 days later and sealed for decades, Dean Martin approached but did not make physical contact with the audience member before being escorted back to the stage by Mr. Carson and security personnel. The show cut to commercial at 11:44 p.m. When they returned, Dean's chair was empty. Johnny told the audience there had been a bit of confusion and introduced the next scheduled guest, a comedian whose name nobody remembers. But stage manager Peter Lassily told a different story to friends years later, according to those who knew him. He claimed Dean did reach the man, that he grabbed the front of his jacket, that Johnny Carson physically pulled Dean backward while 2 security guards formed a human wall between them, that Dean was shouting something that couldn't be broadcast, words that NBC's 7-second delay barely caught in time. A production assistant who was there that night, who spoke on condition of anonymity to a journalist in 2003, remembered it differently still. She said Dean reached the man and just stood there, inches from his face, not saying anything. That the silence was worse than any violence could have been. That the man in the military jacket started crying, kept repeating, "I have PTSD, I have PTSD," and that Dean Martin's face showed something that cameras never captured. Not anger, but a grief so profound it looked like a physical wound. The raw footage has never been released. NBC claimed for years that the tape was damaged during archiving. Some former staff members believe it was deliberately destroyed. Others insist it still exists somewhere in the network's vault, marked with restrictions that ensure it will never see daylight. But the mystery deepens when you examine what happened after the cameras stopped. The man who shouted, his identity has never been publicly confirmed, though investigative efforts over the years have narrowed it to three possibilities, was escorted from the studio by NBC security. He was not arrested. He was not charged. According to building security logs obtained through a Freedom of Information request years later, he left the NBC Burbank facility at 12:17 a.m., roughly 30 minutes after the incident. No police were called. No report was filed with the Burbank Police Department. Why? Former Tonight Show producer Fred D. Cordova refused to discuss the incident in interviews before his death. When pressed by a reporter in 1992, he simply said, "Some things are better left in the past, for everyone involved." Dean Martin never returned to The Tonight Show. Not once. Not ever. He had been a regular guest for over 20 years. He and Johnny had a chemistry that defined an era of television. But after March 21st, 1988, Dean Martin's name disappeared from The Tonight Show booking sheets. When Johnny Carson retired in 1992, Dean wasn't among the parade of legendary guests who returned for the final episodes. The absence was glaring to those who understood the history. Johnny never publicly explained why. In his rare post-retirement interviews, when asked about Dean Martin, Johnny would speak warmly about their friendship, their shared history, the countless nights of laughter, but he never mentioned March 1988. The omission was so consistent, so deliberate, that it became its own form of statement. Dean Martin died on Christmas morning, 1995. Johnny Carson did not attend the funeral. He sent flowers. The card, according to those who saw it, said only, "You were the best, JC." But there's another layer to this story that emerged only recently, through interviews with people who were in the studio that night and chose to speak decades later. The man who shouted at Dean Martin was, by multiple accounts, genuinely suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder related to his service in Vietnam. He had been in the audience as a guest of someone who worked at NBC, a family member or friend who had gotten him a ticket, hoping a night at The Tonight Show might lift his spirits. He had been having a good time during the warm-up, laughing at the comedian who entertained the crowd before taping began. But when Dean Martin mentioned his son being a pilot, something triggered. A switch flipped. The man later told someone, this account comes third-hand, impossible to verify but repeated by multiple sources, that he saw not Dean Martin on that stage, but his own squadron commander from 1968, a man who had ordered missions that resulted in civilian casualties. That he wasn't shouting at an entertainer. He was shouting at a ghost. He didn't know Dean Paul Martin had died 7 months earlier. He didn't know he was attacking a grieving father on live television. He didn't know anything except the rage that had been living inside him for 20 years. When he realized what he'd done, when the people around him reacted in horror, when he saw Dean Martin walking toward him with that terrible look on his face, the full weight of it hit him. According to the production assistant who spoke years later, the man was sobbing by the time security reached him. Not from fear of Dean Martin, from shame. Here's what makes this story even more complicated. Dean Martin reportedly knew. Not immediately, not in that moment on stage, but later. According to people close to Dean, Johnny Carson told him about the man's background, about the PTSD, about the fact that it wasn't personal malice, but mental anguish that had erupted in the worst possible moment. And according to those same sources, Dean Martin tried to find the man. Not to confront him, not to press charges or demand an apology, but because Dean Martin, who had just lost his son, understood something about how grief and trauma could make a person unrecognizable to themselves. Whether Dean ever found him is unknown, whether they ever spoke is unknown. Whether any reconciliation or understanding happened in private is unknown. What is known is this. After March 21st, 1988, Dean Martin's public appearances became increasingly rare. Friends noticed he seemed more withdrawn, more genuinely lost in the drinking that had always been part performance, part reality. The incident on The Tonight Show, whether because of the trauma of being attacked at his most vulnerable or because of something he learned afterward about the man who attacked him, marked a turning point. The Tonight Show incident exposed something that celebrity culture has always tried to hide. The moment when entertainment and real human pain collide, when the stage can no longer contain what's actually happening, when the machinery of television keeps running even as the people inside it are breaking. Johnny Carson spent 3 decades managing those collisions. He was famous for it, the steady hand that could guide a show through technical disasters, difficult guests, controversial moments. But on March 21st, 1988, even Johnny Carson couldn't manage it. He could only follow his friend into the audience and try to pull him back before something irreversible happened. Whether he succeeded depends on how you define success. The show went on. Dean Martin didn't return. The footage disappeared. The audience that night was asked, according to several accounts, not to discuss what they'd seen. This wasn't an official NBC policy, just a quiet request made by staff as people filed out of Studio One. Most complied, a few didn't. Stories leaked, rumors spread, but without video evidence, without official acknowledgement, the incident existed in that strange space between documented history and urban legend. Television networks in the 1980s had enormous power to control narratives. Without social media, without cell phone cameras, without the internet, an incident could simply cease to exist if the network decided it should. NBC decided. The Tonight Show moved forward. Dean Martin moved on, in whatever way he could. But here's the final piece of the story, the one that reframes everything. In 2019, a former NBC archivist came forward, not publicly, but in a conversation with a television historian researching a book about The Tonight Show. The archivist claimed that the raw footage of the March 21st, 1988 incident does still exist, that it's stored in a climate-controlled vault in NBC's archive facility, that it's labeled as restricted, accessible, only with approval from the highest levels of NBC Universal Management. The archivist said they had seen it once during a routine inventory check in the late 1990s. They described what they saw: Dean Martin reaching the man in the audience, Johnny Carson pulling him back, the man sobbing. Dean Martin's face, not angry, not violent, but devastated in a way that made the archivist understand why the footage had been locked away. It wasn't television, the archivist reportedly said. It was too real. It was a man at the absolute end of what he could endure, happening in front of 300 people and however many millions watching at home. You couldn't broadcast that. Not then. Probably not ever. The archivist refused to provide documentation or go on record officially. The story remains unconfirmed. NBC has never acknowledged the footage exists. But someone at that network made a decision 37 years ago. They decided that some moments are too raw, too painful, too human for mass consumption. They decided that Dean Martin's worst night should not become entertainment for future generations. Whether that decision was made out of respect or liability concerns or simple human decency, we may never know. What we do know is that on March 21st, 1988, something broke that couldn't be repaired. A friendship that had defined an era of television ended not with a farewell or a tribute, but with a deleted segment and a story that people still whisper about decades later. Dean Martin lived 7 more years after that night. He never publicly spoke about what happened. Johnny Carson lived 17 years past Dean's death. He never publicly spoke about it either. 2 men who had made millions laugh, who had created countless hours of joy and laughter and genuine human connection through a television screen, shared one final secret. And the question that haunts everyone who knows this story is not what happened in those 90 seconds. The footage might answer that, if it still exists, if it's ever released. The real question is what happened after, in the days and weeks and years that followed, in the conversations that happened or didn't happen, in the reasons why a friendship that had survived everything else couldn't survive this. Maybe some pain is too sharp to see past. Maybe some words, even words shouted by someone who didn't understand their impact, cut too deep to heal. Maybe Dean Martin looked at that Tonight Show stage afterward and could only see the place where a stranger told him his dead son deserved to die. Maybe that was too much to go back to, even for Johnny Carson. Or maybe, and this is what some who knew both men believe, Dean Martin understood that the man who shouted at him was suffering just as much as he was. Maybe he saw in that tormented veteran a reflection of his own pain. Maybe that understanding was somehow worse than the anger would have been. We'll probably never know. The men who could answer these questions are gone. The footage, if it exists, remains locked away. The incident lives on only in memory, in secondhand accounts, in the gaps in Dean Martin's appearance history, in the things Johnny Carson never said. But it happened. On March 21st, 1988, at 11:43 p.m. Eastern Time, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson broadcast a moment that almost no one remembers, but that everyone who was there can never forget. 300 people in that studio witnessed something that television wasn't supposed to show: the complete dissolution of the boundary between performer and person, the moment when grief stopped being something managed and became something that couldn't be contained. And somewhere in NBC's archives, if the stories are true, a tape exists that proves it. The question is, should we ever see it?